Thank you very much, Jason. And Jason, he contacted me a few months ago, and we talked about topics, and the topic that came up was, well, let's talk about the recreational catfishing scene. And I thought, great, there's so much going on, there's such a variety of things happening, and it's a very vibrant, dynamic fishery for a lot of different species. So after we talked, I made a little Word document on my desktop, and as I worked on the magazines and various things and ideas came up, I kept adding to that list and adding to that list, and then I kind of go, instead of saying it's great to have a lot of information, there's almost too much information out there, so I kind of had to whittle it down a little bit. And so I decided to do is stick with what we primarily deal with at the magazine, which is rod and reel fishing. There's limb lining, trout lining, jug lining, noodling, and a variety of species: channel cats, flatheads, blue cats, rivers, ponds, lakes, reservoirs. So we kind of had to narrow it down a little bit. So recreational, I'll talk about the recreational scene in terms of rod and reel mostly, and primarily deal with taking a look at what anglers are doing out there in terms of how they're fishing, the methods they're using, the tactics they're utilizing, and then consider a little bit more about the changes that have occurred over the past 20 years, or actually maybe 22 years now, since the first Catfish Symposium occurred. So stepping back just to look at some overall numbers, I don't think we have a whole lot of numbers in terms of what the catfishing community looks like in terms of how many people are fishing, and the numbers we do have generally come from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service survey on fishing, hunting, and wildlife associated recreation. And overall, over the past 20 years or so, there's been about 7 million catfish anglers age 16 years or older in the United States, and that numbers has stayed fairly consistent over time. There was a little bump there in 2016 of about 1 million, but the Fish and Wildlife Service says it's not a statistically significant increase, but maybe there is some real change that has occurred. And overall, the catfishing makes up about 27 to 28% of sport fishing overall in the United States. So there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of change in terms of numbers percentage-wise, but I think when we consider, and I think we've all seen the changes that have happened over the past 20 years, some of them have been pretty substantial. So starting out with channel cats. Of course, I kind of think of channel cats as the ambassador of the catfish community, of the ichthyolure. It's sort of like bass or maybe bluegills of Citrarchids. They've introduced a lot of young people and older people to fishing, and you just as soon see people fishing for channel cats in a suburban or urban fishery as you would on a more secluded, scenic, rural river or pond or reservoir, or as part of a vibrant guide service down south, as Chad Ferguson, a guide we know, down on North Texas reservoirs, or maybe it's Santee Cooper, wherever. A lot of guides out there that are fishing for catfish and getting people excited about catfishing. Of course, some anglers like to catch catfish to eat, so they take some home and have a nice fish fry, while other anglers are targeting trophies, and they're primarily catch and release anglers. This is a shot of up at Selkirk, up at the Red River of the North, and just a fantastic, phenomenal fishery. We've all heard of it, but this is a standard channel cat that you might catch up there, and you'd be able to get multiple ones like that during an average day. That's Christian Hoffman, one of our videographers. So the great bait debate. This is something that goes on with channel cat anglers all the time. This is the question we always get. What do people like? What's the best bait to use for channel cats? People are using a lot of different things, as we all know. Worms and natural baits like crawdads and cut bait, hot dogs, chicken livers, dog food, even soap. And in the middle there's blood bait. That's like coagulated cow blood or chicken blood, and that's basically kind of a refined, smaller fishery, a specialized fishery, primarily in probably the Great Plains area where they're using that. And then, of course, all the whole host of manufactured baits we'll get into in a little bit here. But primarily, when you look at the most popular baits out there and most effective baits, cut bait is one of them. Whether it's shad or skipjack herring or suckers or whatever natural fish are caught from the system where you're targeting catfish. And then there's a variety of riggings that anglers are using, as we all know. There's standard bottom rigs. This is just a typical slip sinker rig here with a sliding egg sinker to a swivel, to a leader and a hook, and these can be modified in various ways. There's a whole host of modifications. Float rigging is also a fairly popular way to fish in ponds and lakes as well as streams. And three-way rigs, which have a dropper leader coming down to a weight. These tend to be used quite a lot in drifting situations and reservoirs, or when you're doing controlled drifting in rivers where you want to keep the bait off the bottom a little bit. And if it's snaggy, you can oftentimes use a lighter pound test dropper line to that'll break off. You won't lose your whole rig. There's just a ton of different, some folks might have a double leader where you have a two-hooked rig and so on and so forth. So popular hooks that tend to be used out there today are typical J styles, like an octopus hook, or the wide gaps. These are the kale hooks. These are popular. They hold large portions of bait, and they have a wide gap that tends to improve hooking. And circle hooks are becoming very popular, and that's a large change that we've seen over the past, say 20 years or so, 10 to 15 years, where a lot more anglers are using a variety of circle hooks, and there's just a ton of different types out there. And it's just basically where the point rotates back toward the hook shank, and that pretty much defines a circle hook. But the benefits of the circle hook seem to be fairly clear in terms of catfishing, where this is the typical area of the mouth that you would tend to have a circle hook a catfish. There's a little bit of a learning curve to using them, but as long as you let the catfish progressively load the rod and just kind of move off with the circle hook in its mouth, it rotates and turns and comes and hooks them right in the corner of the mouth. And it really does reduce gut hooking, and those fish tend to be very highly releasable. And then you have the whole world of manufactured baits, the dip baits, paste baits, doughs, chunks, the stuff you can fill in those little Mr. Whisker tubes and all those things. The dip bait is probably the most popular manufactured bait that's available. Mostly popular down in the southern regions, warmer water, where you get a lot more scent dispersal, but more northern anglers are starting to pick up on the benefits of using some dip baits in their catfishing, mostly for channel cats. And those dip baits are presented on various types of carriers that are basically just ribbed, soft plastic contraptions that are either utilize a treble hook or a J-style hook, and oftentimes we'll replace a treble hook with a circle hook, and they work perfectly well with a circle hook too. Now you just jam that down into the dip bait, pull it out, and you're ready to go. Punch baits are another popular bait type, particularly in the Central Plains down into the South Central regions. And it's like a dip bait, but punch baits, you don't have to have a bait carrier. You can just use a standard treble hook, and it has fibers that are built into the bait. So when you punch it down, that hook down into the punch bait and pull it out, you'll have a glob of that on there, and it tends to stay on there. And a lot of times punch baits are utilized with chum, which I'll get into in a second. But anyway, just a shot of a dip bait tube showing that scent dispersal and the bait coming off that and attracting that catfish. So chum, now this is where you're dealing with using fermented grains, soybeans, a variety of different grains. And usually the anglers aren't throwing out buckets of chum like this. It's just a handful. We did some chumming fishing with a fella in Kansas, Dave Schmidtline. And it's just a handful here and there to attract fish. And once those fish are attracted to an area, he fishes punch baits vertically over the side. So if the bite dies, he throws another handful of chum out and activates the bite again. Ice fishing for catfish. Okay. Whoops.
Oh, it's moving.
Volume on here. I was hoping it didn't volume, but let me turn it down here a little bit.
Feels pretty nice. Yeah, with these catfish, we really don't wait for...
Okay. Where'd it go? I shouldn't have fiddled with the volume.
Back up, come back onto it. Autoplay.
Let's go back here. Let's slide that down.
Which I can help you out. Let's see.
Oh, a little bit farther up there. Okay, yep, right there. One more down. Perfect.
Start from that one.
Yep.
For them to run.
Okay, thank you.
Flag. We're mostly using dead bait here.
Right. So I was going to mention here about ice fishing is that this is a technique that's becoming more popular up north in the ice belt, particularly along, southern edges of the ice belt. The channel cat fishery and ice fishing tends to be fairly active throughout the ice period. Up north, mostly first ice and last ice, but using cut bait, for example, on a jig or a plain hook, and just waiting for that fish to come by. They tend to be very, they strike very softly. So we've had video cameras down where we've seen the fish just sort of come up and rub their bodies and sort of taste the bait as they make their way around that bait, and then they'll kind of disappear and then come back up and just sort of grab it and swim off. That's kind of a cool thing to see. Okay, moving on to flatheads. Now this tends to be, as we know, a more specialized fishery. There's fewer people probably fishing for flatheads than channel cats. Typically, anglers out after trophy flatheads are fishing at nighttime. This is a guide that works, Tabitha Linville, who works out of the Kanawha River area in West Virginia. They fish that river in the Ohio. And that's their guide boat. Typical setup, much beefier rods and reels. You can see them on the rod holders there for various clients to use as they're fishing during the evening. But also during the daytime, more anglers are learning about how to catch catfish during the day. And a lot of that has to do, or to catch flatheads during the day, and a lot of that has to do with a lot of the telemetry work that the biologists have done, showing where where flatheads go during the day in terms of wood piles and log jams, and they move out during the evening and feed along adjacent areas. This is Doug, our editor-in-chief, with a flathead we got out of Lake Tawakoni. That was the biggest flathead we've had on film. And they're using, flathead anglers are using large live baits typically, although some anglers also are finding cut baits effective at certain times of the year. Big bullheads, carp, green sunfish, whatever's legal in the area that the anglers are fishing, they like to send out those big live baits. Typical scenario would be to anchor up upside of a large log jam on an outside bend of a river where catfish might be holding, particularly during the day, or maybe fishing those adjacent areas at night and waiting for the big flatheads to come through. On large rivers, same kind of scenario. The anglers are typically looking for some form of cover that the flatheads are using. In the top left there is a barge tie-off example on a large river where some woody debris is accumulated. So anchoring, casting those big live baits up into the cover areas, or working those baits under those barge moorings. And another scenario here is just some boulder and log structures that anglers may target those flatheads. And reservoirs too. There's a reservoir. There's a contingent of reservoir anglers that fish for flatheads in reservoirs, and they're also targeting cover or channel edges or structural elements that these fish tend to utilize as edges. This is Robbie Robinson. He passed away a few years ago. He is a very well-known guide in fisherman for flathead in Ohio reservoirs. And he would fish out of his pontoon boat and utilize a small skiff to pull baits out, set baits in areas, and then go back to his pontoon boat where he would fish from there. And that was a way of keeping the baits a little bit more healthy. Instead of lobbing them way out there, you can bring them out, gently set them, and bring them back. And the rigs that flathead anglers are using are basically beefed up versions of what channel catfish anglers are using. Slip sinker rigs, but you may see 6 to 8 to 10 ounce sinkers on those things, and 80 to 120 pound test line. And same thing, just beefed up riggings on the floats. There's a bluegill on that one. And then there's brush hooks and limb lines and a lot of variety of other methods that they're using along riverbanks and reservoir timber and so on. Glenn Flowers is a guy down in Florida, and this is just an example of a bank, kind of a bank line technique where he'll take his boat, go across, set a limb line with a bait hanging from it, come back across the river, and when that bait is taken, he can reel in that fish from the other side of the river. And he uses a lot of surface fishing. A lot of anglers tend to fish deep down into those wood piles, but some flatheads do get attracted to that surface commotion. There's a bluegill hanging off that bank line, and then there's a shot of that flathead coming up, getting ready to take that bluegill. So I think that there was a picture of that one caught. It wasn't a giant one, but it's kind of an ominous looking scene. And in the world of catfishing, there's probably, I think, been no other catfish that's kind of captured the imagination of anglers in terms of really getting them fired up about trophy catfishing is this one here, the world record that was caught in 2004 by Cody Mullinex out of Lake Texoma. He was bank fishing using surf casting techniques. I think it was like the big mineral arm. I can't remember the arm of the reservoir he was on, but that was 121 and a half pound fish. What was neat about that one was it was kept alive, and it was brought to the Freshwater Fisheries Center at Texas Parks and Wildlife in Athens, where it lived in a tank for about a year or so, and it was going to be released, but I believe it died from an infection. And it may be related to the initial hook wound, I don't know, but literally thousands of people came and saw this fish. This was the media covered this fish. It was in newspapers and magazines, and really captured the imagination and fascination of a lot of anglers. After that world record, several others were caught, and it seemed like in pretty rapid succession. Just a year later, Tim Pruitt caught one 124 pounds out of the Mississippi River. 130 pounder in 2010, Greg Bernal. And then in 2011, 143 pounder out of the Roanoke River system at Kerr-Bugs Island on the North Carolina-Virginia border. So, are there more big catfish out there being produced, or are anglers getting better and more knowledgeable and skilled at finding them and catching them? So the next question would be that kind of is the buzz is where's the 150 going to come from? Where's that next big giant going to come from? And that slew of big blues that were caught really created a vibrant guide industry for trophy catfish and trophy blues. This is a shot from Ryan Casey. He's a guide that fishes out of the St. Louis area, in the Missouri River and Mississippi River in that area. And what a great chance for people to go out and get a 60, 70, 80, 90 plus pound catfish and pose in front of an iconic landmark like that, whether it's the Arch or like Michael Kittner or Jason Kittner down there in the lower left where he's on the Potomac River with that introduced population, growing very large fish and posing in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Recently had an article in the magazine written by Corey Schmidt, and he kind of outlined and just kind of gave a perspective on where some of these giant big blues are coming from, and we could probably list a whole many more of these. But northeast river systems like the James and the Potomac tend to be areas where big fish are coming from. Kerr Lake and Lake Gaston, other one, the Roanoke River system. The Tennessee River system, Wilson and Wheeler Lakes, Pickwick area, those are all waters that have produced giant fish. Mississippi River, Ohio River, North Texas reservoirs, Lake Tawakoni is a hot reservoir right now, but really that big 150 can come from so many different places. One area that the guys that are after big blues are focusing on now is that area down there about south of Baton Rouge, south to, the southern end of the Mississippi River. There's some big giant fish down there, but they really tend to be overlooked, and there isn't anybody fishing. There doesn't tend to be any guides fishing and so on. The Roanoke River has kind of had a kind of a surprising number of big fish being caught out of it in those reservoir systems. This is Zach Royce. We saw that the world record came from Bugs Island, but in Gaston, Zach Royce set the state record twice within 24 hours. He caught a 90-something pounder and a 100-something pounder within an 18-hour period. And that kind of really caught the media's attention and anglers' attention. Another area that tends to be overlooked when we think about the potential for giant blues is California. The reservoirs around San Diego and SoCal, there's been several 100-plus pound fish caught there. Ronson Smothers is one of our contributors that helps provide information from out that way. And fish a little bit differently. They don't sink big bottom rigs down with cut bait. They tend to free line, cut mackerel, and utilize more of the local species. In this case, bringing in some marine species to fish with. But a typical day on a trophy blue cat trip is bait procurement. Typically, cast nets are thrown out to catch skipjack, shad, whatever it would be, keep it alive. They have some good fresh bait for the day. Some anglers utilize frozen bait when they need to, but for the most part, the fresh bait tends to be what they're after, the live bait or fresh bait. And the different parts of the fish are used, from heads to fillets, whole fish. Some of these baits are fairly large, and more anglers now are finding that Asian carp cut bait is also effective at catching big blue cats in the big river systems. The riggings tend to be beefed up versions again of what you might see for channel cats, 60, 80, 100-pound main line with leaders, big sinkers, circle or wide gap hooks. Typical scenario on a large river for blue cats would be to anchor up above a current training structure, navigation structure like a wing dam or a notch dike or something like that, fishing those holes in any of those structure areas that would collect those fish, or ledges on large rivers if there aren't any other artificial structures of fish. Just looking at those fish in those pathways that the fish are utilizing. Three-way rigs tend to be popular too in big rivers for bouncing baits and just working them through various structural areas. Anglers finding these areas on sonar. Slip drifting, where they're actually slowing their drift down with their trolling motor to have a more vertical presentation. And they tend to be very effective at what they do. Tail races still remain very popular areas, especially particular times of year where anglers are using surf casting, long casting techniques to get baits out there, or they're in boats. And electronics have really helped too in increasing the amount of anglers that go after suspended blue cats that tend to concentrate below schools of shad. Maybe there's stripers or hybrid stripers they're kind of ravaging a bunch of shad, and they're feeding on the dead shad that are falling below. Today, more anglers are crossing over too and bringing techniques from other species to fish for catfish. Guide Marlon Ormseth, for example, who was down on the Santee Cooper system, used to live in Iowa, and he was a big walleye angler. Used a lot of planer boards and things like that to cover water. And he found an effective technique down there to fish for blue cats. Slow drifting, half a mile an hour, controlled drifting with your trolling motor, but still very effective. So, if I can think of one thing that has really changed the game over the last 20 years in catfishing, it's been electronics, and fishing in general, really. The technology has gone gangbusters. It's just improving exponentially all the time. The typical dashboard of a cat boat, somebody who does a lot of catfishing, maybe a guide, would have possibly several units on that dashboard. So, in addition to sonar, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second, GPS anchoring and the technology that's available in trolling motors now is just incredible. Unless you're in very strong current, there's really no need to throw out an anchor anymore. I mean, you can just hit, Minn Kota calls it spot lock, but you just hit spot lock on your GPS-enabled trolling motor, and it'll keep you within a 5-6 foot area. It just keeps correcting where you're at. So it really has improved efficiency of how quickly these fish can just start, or these anglers can just start fishing. Mapping precision, custom mapping. The high definition maps now are showing structure and different elements of these water bodies that anglers really haven't seen in the past. And they're also allowing anglers to make their own custom maps that are really fantastic maps. Brad Durick on the Red River of the North, for example, he guides out of Grand Forks. He has fantastic maps of the Red River that otherwise never would have been mapped before. And he's finding all kinds of structures and places to fish. And side scanning is another one. You know, things that were technologies that were military grade are now in the hands of anglers. And you can cruise along a flat or a channel edge or something and just keep an eye out to a couple 100 feet to either side of the boat, and you can spot what likely might be a wood pile or a big catfish. And as an example of putting that into practice, John Jameson came up with this bait walking technique. And you would go up the river and side scan, and maybe 150 feet off the side of the boat, he would see what he would believe would be a catfish or a wood pile or whatever it would be, and he'd put a waypoint there. He wouldn't even go to that area. He would go upstream, anchor, and then using a line counter reel, you know, you might know that fish is 250 feet back based on his GPS or his sonar unit and GPS. He just uses line counter and walk a bait back in current to that area. So it's a very accurate and effective and efficient way to fish. Now the technology's even come further to live scanning, where you almost get television quality video or readouts of sonar, what's happening below, whether it be below the boat or in front of the boat or to the side, whichever way you want to point your transducer. This is what you might see on live scanning sonar, you know, that's offered by most of the sonar companies like Garmin and Humminbird and so on. There's a catfish there that just went by. But you can see the cover, you can see the bait fish, and now you can almost tell exactly what species you're looking at, or at least get a pretty good idea. And of course, thinking beyond catfishing, I'm thinking about some science applications to this too, like, you know, it would be neat in turbid water where you can't use video cameras to utilize some of this technology to see how fish react or behave to barriers, for example, barriers to movement like electrical barriers or physical barriers like fish ladders, or how they react to what their behavior's like around, say, passive gears like a gill net or a hoop net or a trap net, and so forth. The tournament scene is also very vibrant now. See a lot of tournaments from small events, club type events, to large national events that with payouts of tens of thousands of dollars. Cabela's King Cat is one popular one. Mississippi River Monsters, Monsters on the Ohio, all big events attract hundreds of anglers. The Sea Arc Tournament's another big one. And these are highly visible events, especially the larger tournaments. A lot of media presence, a lot of people show up, have fun. You know, there may be some other activities associated with those tournaments, and kids fishing events and so on. And the anglers that do well and tend to compete in a lot of these events tend to be sort of influencers of the catfishing community too. They're covered a lot in the media. They tend to be the people that kind of start trends and ways of thinking. And it's a very tight-knit community. One great opportunity that some agencies may be utilizing tournaments for that I think has a lot of potential too is to utilize the angler data that are caught, and maybe you can use it for standardized collection of data for looking at catch rates and size structure trends over time. Of course, there's going to be biases associated with angler caught data, but if it's standardized and you're looking at something like that over time, it may have some value for looking at trends and various things. There's also a lot of fish that are caught. So in one big tournament, you might have 400 or 500 big giant catfish that you can have data on that otherwise would be very time consuming and labor intensive to capture utilizing other methods of collection. One question that I often think about is the fish mortality. And catfish like warmer water. They're ideally, they survive in warmer water, and maybe the live well conditions aren't as stressful as maybe we might think. But what does the fish mortality look like? Would be an interesting question to answer. I think also with the rise in the popularity of trophy fisheries is we're seeing a concurrent shift in harvest attitudes from catch and keep to more selective harvest. Most of the guides have policies on their boats, if they're trophy guides, to have catch and release policies, while others allow some people to bring home some smaller fish. But it's just a varying degree of that. Anglers now are a whole lot more connected digitally. Forums, social media, blogs, more information is accessible out there than ever before. Some good, some not so good. So it's just when something happens in the catfishing community, word really spreads quickly. Catfish tackle and equipment has seen a lot of changes over the past couple decades. A lot more companies are now offering and specifically dealing in catfish-specific tackle like whisker seekers and bottom dwellers, team catfish, rip and lips, whether it's baits, rods and reels, hooks, for example. And a lot of the major companies like Shakespeare and Berkeley continue to produce catfish-specific tackle. Boats are now being made specifically for the catfish market with big, giant live wells, 100-plus gallon live wells, rod rack systems and rod holder systems, pontoon boats, and so on. And the industry also is seeing more events that just bring catfish anglers together. In fact, this weekend is the Catfish Conference, which usually attracts a couple, maybe a few thousand people out of Louisville. And it's just manufacturers all getting together. It's like an expo. Boat manufacturers, all the tackle companies, and getting people together excited about catfishing and sharing and catfishing. So a lot more to cover, and I hope I kind of hit on the high points of what we're seeing in catfishing today, especially with rod and reel anglers, and definitely looking forward to hearing about the research and management that you guys are all doing in the sessions to come up here in the next day or two. Thank you.
Plenty of time for questions. Questions for Rob. I have a question.
Yeah.
Some people may snicker at this because I know it varies state to state, but for us anyway, vast tournament organizations have evolved in a way that they're working fairly well with the agencies, I think, in a lot of places. I know in Arkansas we don't have a lot of catfish tournament organizations that are based here. I think there's some national. I know there's some national that come here, but you see catfish tournament organizations. I assume you know some of these folks that are running some of these large organizations. You see them working with agencies. Are they moving that direction, or is there still some skepticism like we saw with bass tournaments 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah. A couple of years ago, I gave a presentation on catfish tournaments at a symposium. I think it was a Southern Division meeting. I can't remember offhand. And I did just a really quick survey of the North Central and Southern Division catfish technical committees and had state agencies just give me some general information on the numbers of tournaments that are held in each state. And it was quite high for some of them. But for the most part, a lot of it isn't measured. We really don't know how many there are. But to get to that point, there's a new group that just started. It's called the American Catfishing Association. And it was started by Bill Dance and some other folks in the industry, and I think it was just launched just a couple weeks ago that they had their website go up. I don't think they're going to be a tournament. They're not going to offer tournaments to start. They say they're going to be more in line with conservation concerns and bringing anglers together, focusing on how they could help support catfish conservation. And I know they're calling for people to join committees these committees would then work with states whether it's tournament, I know they want to be affiliated with tournaments, they don't want to run tournaments, but I think there may be some more, if that gets off the ground, there will be more interaction with these committees of the American Catfish Association and the various state agencies. I'm trying to do more communication that way.
Thank you.
I had a quick question. I know it wasn't kind of the focus here, but we're seeing more bow fishing moving into, especially up in the northern areas. It's
Oh, really?
probably been more popular in the southern areas, and bow fishing for catfish has become something that kind of caught us off guard.
Yeah.
In Wisconsin, when it was legalized there, we weren't really expecting it. Is that something you see broadly, or is that just specific kind of spots where that catches on?
Yeah, I think that's specific kind of spots. We don't hear anything about it at the magazine or get any feedback or comments from anybody about it. We haven't heard much.
Any other questions for Rob?
Rob, I think we've come a long way in understanding the impacts of introduced big catfish in our rivers especially. And a lot of the states have come around in the southeast to put it in their management plans not to protect the introduced populations. Yet a lot of the anglers would prefer that, would like to see some protective regulations on the big cats to facilitate trophy fisheries. I was wondering what you all at In-Fisherman are thinking about that, and then what you're seeing anglers' attitudes on that are. And when Flathead was, first kind of introduced in the southeast, a lot of the anglers were really against it and upset by it because it was interfering with some of their other fisheries. And things have come to more of a stabilization now, in my view. What do you think? What's your whole view on the introduced versus the native big cats?
Yeah, well, at the magazine, we tend to, most of what we see tends to, the anglers find value in those fisheries in terms of fishing for those big cats. And of course, there are the negative consequences of them on the native fish, for example, what Pat spoke about. We don't see a lot of anglers nationally anyway, where we're at, focusing specifically on whether they support or, what's, I don't want to say what side or whatever, but we don't see that conversation happening a lot. We do cover in our science angles and bits and pieces, we tend to cover the research that is going on, and we've written about the impacts that those flatheads have had, like on red air sunfish, or was it red breast? I'm sorry, red breast and the mad toms. But at the same time, there is a vibrant fishery for those trophy fish. So.
And I found it, I'm glad Tom asked that question, because I'm sitting here looking at your map where you're showing where the
Yeah.
big fish are coming from, and they're all introduced on the Atlantic coast side.
Yeah.
And so that's not, that's common. You introduce the species to an area where it's not native, and you're gonna see those big fish. And I'm looking at those big blues, and I'm thinking, wow, look at all the native species that aren't there anymore. It's now an adipose tissue with big blues and flatheads.
Yeah, absolutely. And like the flatheads, or down in the Satilla, and what's the other river down there? I'm drawing a blank. But anyway, yeah, and it's going to be interesting to hear. I think I saw in the program there are going to be some more talks on what have been the impacts of looking at the food habits and feeding behaviors of these big fish in these rivers where they're not native. Be interesting to look at. Yeah.
In-Fisherman, of course, very prominent. And what do you see as your role in preventing further spread of these fish by anglers primarily? And do you want to take an active role? Do you want to take a passive role? What do you see as your publication? What do you want to do there?
Yeah, we've always tried to present the best available science on these subjects, and where we can, we would never support any spread of these fish to new waters or in areas where they're not native. We definitely are proponents of, resource protection and sustainability of these fisheries and native fish communities. And I think if there's a fishery there that is a popular, like trophy fishery, for example, we'll write about it. But we hope that isn't going to promote any continued or further stocking or moving around, bait bucket kind of angler transfers of any of these fish anywhere else. But it's kind of covering the sport fishing scene, but at the same time being sensitive to the problems and issues that species introductions like that can cause. And that's where it's also great for, we've always tried to connect and bridge the gap between science and angling. And we love it when scientists help and contribute to, and we have a lot of scientists that do write for the magazine. Dr. Hal Schramm, for one, who covered this topic several times, probably now, looking at the whole world of invasive catfish. What are the issues? What are perhaps maybe some of the solutions? So the more good science communication we have, I think the better off everybody, will be in terms of anglers and other users of the resources. Mark?
No, but neat thing about fisherman's role, you guys have a really good sense of the angling community, what they feel is important, not just for the species they fish and that kind of stuff there, but are you getting a sense from that community that there's other issues out there? For example, like water quality issues impacting other major fisheries, are they getting more mobile on that? They're very fervent on a lot of their opinions on certain things. Are they a group that we hopefully activate, help us
Yeah.
things up or fix some problems?
I think that's a group that can be activated quickly, and I think they do have there's a certain population of that, the subpopulation of the angling, catfish angling public that is very vocal. One area, for example, maybe we don't hear so much about water quality problems, but pay lakes. That's an issue that has come up. I wrote an article, I don't know, boy, it must be 10 years ago now, about pay lakes. And it wasn't a for or against pay lakes type of article. It was just sort of a non-biased expose, or whatever you want to call it, of here's what pay lakes are, here's who's using them, and interviews with pay lake owners, anglers, guides on the Ohio River, for example. And boy, what a kerfuffle that article caused. There were more comments online, and that was a scenario where you could tell that those anglers were on both sides of the issue, were very passionate, and they got active very quickly. And I'm glad I lived all the way up in Minnesota and not on the banks of the Ohio somewhere. But yeah, they definitely can be activated. And that would be one example of an issue that is a topic of debate now among them.
Still got time?
One more question.
All right, well, since we're talking about the science and maybe stirring up a little controversy, Rob, we've seen a lot of climate change issues demonstrable now in sport fisheries. We've seen in the East Coast, a lot of our diagenous fish runs, the timing of them is changing, and that affects fishing. And in your neck of the woods, we're seeing a lot of the walleye population struggling, being replaced by smallmouth bass.
Mm-hmm.
In fishermen is not a climate denier, if I know from reading some of your stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What's your whole policy on that, on bringing the message home to anglers who may or may not notice it in their fishing?
Yeah, well, it's either addressed directly or indirectly. I think in some articles and some of the contributing authors that we have, and in terms some of the things that I write, that topic will come up as part of the discussion of the article, for example, and if the article's on northern pike, you know, there are concerns about climate change impacts on pelagic cold water prey fish like whitefish and ciscos. And there may be a paragraph or two in that article that might refer to research or studies that have been done showing how these things are shifting, the communities are shifting. In that case, it may be more applied and practical in terms of then what would the pike angler do to utilize some other type of tactic in that system. But the science is presented there, or it's presented in directly as the bits and pieces science shorts. You know, there may be a study in Transactions of the American Fisheries Society or Canadian Journal that has some interesting results of research that have showed what those shifts might be or what some of the future fisheries might look like, and that might be more suitable for a article summary in a bits and pieces column. So we try to do those as well.
Thanks, Rob.
Mm-hmm.